Welcome to Cognitive Spirals, exploring the latest research into consciousness, cognition, and machine intelligence. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of AI and its applications in scientific search. It's an area ripe with potential, but also fraught with challenges as we try to navigate the ever-growing sea of scientific literature.
Yeah, it's definitely a pressing issue. I mean, the sheer volume of research papers published every year is just staggering. Keeping up with it all is practically impossible for any individual scientist, even within a very narrow field.
Absolutely. And that's where AI comes in, right? The promise of AI-powered search is that it can sift through this massive amount of data, identify relevant papers, and even potentially uncover connections that humans might miss. But the question is, how well is it actually doing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think current approaches are, well, they're brute force. They rely on massive data sets and statistical correlations, but they don't really understand the science in the way a human does. It's like trying to build a bridge by just piling up rocks until it stays up.
That's a really interesting analogy, Donald, and it resonates with some of my own concerns. I think the current focus on purely statistical approaches like deep learning is missing something crucial. The brain doesn't just look for correlations, it builds models of the world. It integrates information from different sensory modalities, understands causality, and makes inferences. And crucially, yes, it understands causalities, it uses spatiotemporal information to contextualize everything.
I agree that there are limitations, but I think deep learning has made incredible strides. You look at some of the recent advances in natural language processing, and it's hard to deny that these models are learning to understand language at a pretty deep level. Maybe they don't understand causality in the same way a human does, but they're certainly able to identify complex relationships between concepts.
I'm still skeptical. I think we're confusing correlation with understanding. Deep learning models are good at finding patterns, but they don't really reason. They can't explain why a particular result is relevant or what the underlying mechanisms are. They're essentially black boxes.
Exactly. And that's a huge problem for scientific search. If you're relying on an AI to find relevant papers, you need to be able to trust its recommendations. You need to be able to understand why it thinks a particular paper is important. Otherwise, you're just blindly following its suggestions.
And in science, explainability is paramount. I mean, we need to be able to critically evaluate the evidence and understand the reasoning behind any conclusion. A black box AI just doesn't cut it.
Okay, I see your point about explainability. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Deep learning has opened up new possibilities for scientific search. For example, these models can be trained to identify papers that are semantically similar, even if they don't use the same keywords. That's something that traditional search methods often struggle with.
But that semantic similarity is still based on statistical correlations, isn't it? It's not based on a true understanding of the underlying concepts. I think we need to move towards more neurosymbolic approaches, where we combine the strengths of neural networks with symbolic reasoning.
I agree. I think neurosymbolic approaches are definitely promising. We need to find a way to represent scientific knowledge in a more structured and meaningful way, so that the AI can actually reason about it. And I think spatiotemporal information is key to that. The brain is constantly integrating information from different sensory modalities, and it's doing it in a way that's inherently spatial and temporal.
Yes, and consider the concept of embodied cognition. Our understanding of the world is deeply intertwined with our physical experiences. How can we capture that in an AI system for scientific search? How can we give it a sense of the context in which scientific knowledge is created and used?
That's a fascinating idea. So, you're suggesting that the AI should have some kind of embodied understanding of the scientific process? Like it should understand what it's like to conduct an experiment, analyze data, and write a paper?
Well, not necessarily embodied in the literal sense, but it should have a more sophisticated understanding of the scientific method, the different types of evidence, and the logical relationships between hypotheses, experiments, and results. That requires more than just statistical pattern recognition. It requires symbolic reasoning.
And it requires the ability to translate between different coordinate systems. Think about how a physicist uses different mathematical representations to describe the same phenomenon. They might use Euclidean geometry for some calculations and then switch to a different coordinate system for others. An intelligent AI should be able to do the same thing.
Right. And even something as fundamental as the time dimension, a scientific discovery isn't just a static fact. It's a process that unfolds over time. It has a history, a context, and potential future implications. The AI needs to be able to understand that temporal dimension.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not just about finding relevant papers, it's about understanding the entire scientific landscape, the relationships between different concepts, the temporal evolution of knowledge, and the different ways of representing that knowledge.
Exactly. And that's why I think we need to focus on developing more sophisticated neuro-symbolic algorithms that can capture these different aspects of scientific knowledge. We need to move beyond the black box approach of deep learning and build AI systems that can actually reason about science.
And that means understanding how the brain itself represents and processes information. The brain is the ultimate example of an intelligent system, and we should be looking to it for inspiration.
Absolutely. I think the brain two model approach is incredibly promising. We need to try to reverse engineer the brain to understand how it represents and manipulates information. And then we need to translate those principles into AI algorithms.
But how do we actually do that? I mean, the brain is incredibly complex. Where do we even start?
Well, I think we need to focus on specific cognitive functions like decision-making and memory formation. We can study the neural correlates of these functions and then try to develop algorithms that mimic those processes. We also need to focus on how the brain represents information in a flexible way. How does it learn so effectively with limited examples?
And we need to pay attention to the spatiotemporal aspects of neural activity. How do different parts of the brain represent different spatial and temporal scales, and how do these representations interact? That's where I think the real breakthroughs will come.
Right. For example, consider how the brain integrates information from different sensory modalities. When you see a bird flying, you're not just processing visual information, you're also integrating auditory information, the sound of its wings, and potentially even tactile information, the feeling of the wind. The brain seamlessly integrates all of this information to create a unified percept. How can we build AI systems that do the same thing?
That's a great example. And it highlights the limitations of current AI approaches, which tend to treat different modalities in isolation. But I think there's progress being made in multimodal learning. Researchers are developing models that can learn from both visual and textual data, for example.
But again, it's still mostly based on statistical correlations. The AI is learning to associate certain visual patterns with certain words, but it's not really understanding the relationship between the two. It's not understanding that the visual pattern represents a bird and the word bird refers to that same thing. That requires symbolic reasoning.
And it requires the ability to translate between different representations of space and time. The brain isn't just processing visual and auditory information in separate channels, it's integrating them into a unified spatiotemporal representation. That's what allows us to understand the world as a dynamic, evolving scene.
Exactly. And think about the implications for scientific search. If the AI could understand the spatiotemporal context of scientific discoveries, it could potentially uncover connections that humans might miss. It could see how different ideas evolved over time, how they relate to each other, and how they might be applied to new problems. It's kind of like the scientist is trying to recreate the brain in silicon.
Okay, so let's talk about some specific examples of how AI is currently being used in scientific search. One area where it's making a big impact is in drug discovery. AI models are being used to screen massive libraries of molecules to identify potential drug candidates.
And how well is that working? I mean, I've heard some promising stories, but I've also heard a lot of hype.
It's still early days, but there have been some notable successes. For example, there's a company called Atomwise that uses AI to identify potential drug candidates for a variety of diseases. They've had some success in finding new treatments for Ebola and multiple sclerosis.
But even in those cases, the AI is essentially just doing pattern recognition, right? It's identifying molecules that are similar to known drugs or that bind to specific protein targets. It's not really understanding the complex biological mechanisms that underlie the disease.
Right. It's like finding a key that fits a lock without understanding how the lock actually works. And that's a problem because it means that the AI can easily be fooled by misleading correlations. It might identify a molecule that looks promising on the surface, but that turns out to be toxic or ineffective in the long run.
Exactly. And that's why I think we need to develop AI systems that can actually model the biological processes involved in the disease. We need to build AI systems that can understand how different molecules interact with each other, how they affect cellular function, and how they ultimately impact the disease.
And that requires a much deeper level of understanding than current AI approaches can provide. It requires the ability to represent and reason about complex causal relationships, and to translate between different levels of abstraction.
Okay, so drug discovery is one example. What about other areas of scientific search? What about finding relevant papers in a specific field?
That's another area where AI is being used, but again, with limited success. Current AI systems can identify papers that are relevant to a specific topic, but they often miss the nuances and subtleties of the research. They might surface papers that are superficially related, but that don't actually address the core questions.
And they often struggle to identify papers that are truly innovative or groundbreaking. They tend to focus on the most popular and well-cited papers, but they miss the hidden gems that are buried in the literature.
Right. It's like the AI is only seeing the trees and missing the forest. It's not able to understand the broader context of the research, the underlying assumptions, and the potential implications.
So what's the solution? How can we build AI systems that are better at finding relevant and innovative papers?
I think we need to focus on developing AI systems that can understand the meaning of scientific papers. We need to build AI systems that can extract the key concepts, identify the main arguments, and evaluate the evidence. And that requires more than just statistical pattern recognition. It requires symbolic reasoning and a deep understanding of the scientific method.
And it requires the ability to translate between different representations of scientific knowledge. We need to find a way to represent scientific concepts in a way that's both accurate and flexible, so that the AI can reason about them in a meaningful way.
And we need to incorporate spatiotemporal information into the AI's understanding of scientific knowledge. We need to build AI systems that can understand how scientific ideas evolve over time, how they relate to each other, and how they might be applied to new problems.
Okay, so let's get a little more concrete. What are some specific research directions that we should be pursuing?
From my perspective, I think we need to focus on understanding how the brain integrates information from different sensory modalities. How does it combine visual, auditory, and tactile information to create a unified percept? And how can we translate those principles into AI algorithms? That means studying the neural circuits that underlie multisensory integration and developing computational models that mimic those circuits.
I think we need to continue to explore the potential of deep learning for scientific search. We need to find ways to make these models more transparent and explainable, so that we can trust their recommendations. And we need to find ways to incorporate more data into these models, so that they can learn more effectively. Specifically, focusing on leveraging scientific knowledge graphs and ontologies to improve the semantic understanding of deep learning models.
I think we need to focus on developing more sophisticated neurosymbolic algorithms. We need to combine the strengths of neural networks with symbolic reasoning, so that we can build AI systems that can actually reason about science. That means developing new algorithms for knowledge representation, inference, and learning.
And I think we need to focus on understanding how the brain represents and manipulates spatiotemporal information. We need to study the neural circuits that underlie spatial and temporal reasoning and develop computational models that mimic those circuits. And we need to find ways to represent scientific knowledge in a way that's both spatial and temporal.
Another interesting research direction is to explore how the brain uses hierarchical processing to represent complex information. The brain doesn't just process information in a flat, linear way. It organizes it into hierarchies with different levels of abstraction. How can we build AI systems that do the same thing? And how can we use hierarchical processing to improve the efficiency and robustness of AI algorithms?
Building on that, I think we need to investigate how deep learning models can be used to automatically extract knowledge from scientific text. Can we train these models to identify key concepts, relationships, and arguments in scientific papers? And can we use that knowledge to build more sophisticated scientific search engines?
And following on from that, I think we need to develop methods for evaluating the performance of AI systems for scientific search. How can we measure how well these systems are doing? And how can we ensure that they're not just reinforcing existing biases in the scientific literature?
I'd also suggest looking into how the brain adapts and learns in real time. The brain is constantly adjusting its internal models of the world based on new experiences. How can we build AI systems that do the same thing? And how can we use real-time learning to improve the performance of AI algorithms for scientific search?
And the ability to abstract and generalize. The human brain is amazing at learning from limited examples and applying knowledge to new situations. I would focus on building AI that is biologically plausible.
I think there's also a lot of potential in exploring the use of graph neural networks for scientific search. These models are designed to work with graph-structured data, which makes them well-suited for representing scientific knowledge. Can we use graph neural networks to build more sophisticated scientific search engines that can understand the complex relationships between different concepts?
And I think we need to focus on developing AI systems that can explain their reasoning. We need to build AI systems that can not only find relevant papers, but also explain why they think those papers are relevant. That requires more than just providing a list of keywords. It requires providing a coherent and understandable explanation of the underlying logic.
And I think we need to look at the brain's ability to anticipate future events. The brain isn't just reacting to the present, it's constantly making predictions about the future. How can we build AI systems that do the same thing? And how can we use predictive modeling to improve the performance of AI algorithms for scientific search?
These are all great points. It's clear that we're still in the early stages of developing AI systems for scientific search. But the potential is enormous. If we can build AI systems that can truly understand scientific knowledge, we can accelerate the pace of discovery and solve some of the world's most pressing problems.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting field, and I think we're making progress every day. With more data, better algorithms, and a deeper understanding of the brain, I'm confident that we can build AI systems that will revolutionize the way we do science.
I agree, but we need to be careful not to get caught up in the hype. We need to focus on building AI systems that are not only powerful, but also transparent, explainable, and trustworthy.
And we need to remember that the brain is the ultimate example of an intelligent system. We should be looking to it for inspiration and trying to understand how it represents and processes information. That's the key to unlocking the full potential of AI for scientific search.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you all for joining us on Cognitive Spirals. We hope you found this discussion informative and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep exploring the frontiers of consciousness, cognition, and machine intelligence.